first of the 6 common function types we're going to look at is the absolute value function. F of x equals the absolute value, indicated by these vertical bars, of x, is the absolute value function. Now, I like to also call these toolkit functions. So if you hear me say toolkit functions, that's what I mean. The domain of this function is minus infinity to infinity. The range is 0, including 0, to infinity. Function's decreasing on minus infinity to 0 and increasing 0 to infinity, and this function is even. And more importantly, at the moment, here is our graph. It has a sharp corner at 0. And all of these characteristics should seem familiar from our previous sections. The next function we want to look at is f of x equals x to the power of 2, x squared, the standard quadratic function. Here is the graph of that function. It doesn't have a sharp corner there. It bends at 0, 0. The domain of this function is minus infinity to infinity. The range is 0, again, including 0, to positive infinity. The function's decreasing on the interval minus infinity to 0 and increasing from 0 to infinity, and this function is also even. Our next function is the square root function, which is the inverse, for all intents and purposes, the inverse of the quadratic, the square root function. This looks like half of a parabola. It does. And the domain of this function is 0 to positive infinity. The range is also 0 to positive infinity. The function's increasing on 0 to positive infinity, and it is neither even nor odd. The next function we have is x cubed. F of x equals x to the power of 3. The standard cubic function, and it looks similar in some sense to the quadratic. Its behavior on either side, it has a bending feature there. The domain of this function is minus infinity to infinity. The range of this function is minus infinity to infinity as well. The function is increasing on minus infinity to infinity, and this function is odd. For our last function, we have the cube root function. F of x equals, and this is similar to the square root, but we have an index of 3, notated right here. And this is the inverse of the x cubed function, which is why they're next to each other. Has some similar behavior, but it is reflected across the line y equals x. The domain of this function is minus infinity to infinity. The range of this function is minus infinity to infinity. This function is increasing on that same interval, minus infinity to infinity, and this function is also odd.